Boom, there it goes. So, all right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you all for being here. My name is Marlon Richardson. I am the education director for an amazing organization by the name of Hip Hop for Change, and we're really here, really blessed and privileged to be here to present to you all something that we've been presenting to the Bay Area and around the world. It's a thing called the MC, which is an acronym, and I'll get into all the details of that acronym in a moment. But this is going to be kind of a free flowing, informative, engaging, interactive kind of presentation slash workshop. The whole idea is for you all to get a better understanding of hip hop culture, hip hop history, and then we're going to dabble into different aspects of the culture and give you a chance to engage in different elements that revolve around hip hop creativity. So if you didn't think that you were going to be creative today, you're definitely going to be creative today. So throw that little cap on, that creative hat, that creative identity. If you want to create an artist name for yourself, go ahead and change your name right now because we're really going to get into it. So if I am allowed to share my screen, which I believe I am, we are going to go full throttle into this thing that I call the MC. So make sure I have the sound going and the screen. Boom. If you're able to see my screen, give me a thumbs up. Quick thumbs up. Excellent, excellent, excellent. We're going to go from the tippy top of this presentation. Okay, so what we're presenting to you today is an excerpt or just one small unit of a long, more comprehensive program that we have entitled the MC. The MC is actually an acronym that stands for the Theory of Hip Hop, Evolution, Music, and Culture. So through this program that we teach kindergarten through 12th grade as well as the university level, we're bringing education in terms of the history of and the culture of hip hop, how it became a party in the Bronx to the billion-dollar music industry that it is today, right? And we'll be going through and reviewing all the different elements of hip hop and engaging in some of those moments and kind of pinpointing detailed moments in history of the culture. So a little bit about Hip Hop for Change. This is the organization that I'm proud to represent. We are a Oakland-based 501c3. We've been around 8 years. We're celebrating our 8th year this year. And our mission statement is Hip Hop for Change uses grassroots activism to educate people about socioeconomic injustices and advocate solutions through hip hop culture. So that's a very long, grown up way of saying that we use hip hop as a way of empowering ourselves, in turn, in healing ourselves, but then also in turn, empowering and healing the communities that we come from. So a little bit about yours truly. I go by the artist name Unlearn the World. I am an MC, producer, DJ, all the things, overall hip hop creative. I like to consider myself a creative director of sorts, working with other artists locally, nationally, all the things. I am an MC, like I said, beat maker, actor, poet, father, and I am an activist, right? I use a lot of the things that I feel deeply about regarding social issues, and I reflect on those in my music as my form of activism, as well as the education space that I am in. So far, Hip Hop for Change has taught 25,000 students all around the Bay Area in all the elements of hip hop, and I'm very proud to be the education director of this organization where I not only create curriculum for students to learn from, but I also train local artists in dynamic mindfulness, trauma informed care, and really how to be teachers bringing their craft into the classroom. So I want to hear from you all really quickly. Let's do an energy check before we get into this question that I have. But let's go ahead and type your energy levels in the chat on a scale of 1 to 5, how we're feeling. 1 being I'm exhausted, I'm tired, it was a rough week. 5 being it's lit, the sun is out. I don't even know why I'm on the Zoom because it's so warm, but I'm fit to go out later. Go ahead and put how you're feeling on a scale of 1 to 5 in this chat right here. I'm at a 5, so I'm gonna set it off. Let's see how everybody else is feeling. Make sure everybody else is doing all right. 5 out of 5, 4.5. We got a lot of fives in here. Awesome. Awesome. Excellent. So, good. Now that I know that you all are engaged with me and you're all on the same page, let's get into this. What is hip hop, right? Let's play word association. When I say the word hip hop, go ahead and type in some of the words that come to mind. When you hear the word hip hop, what are some of the words that come to mind for you? And don't just give me an artist name. Give me some words that you think about when you hear the word hip hop. Go ahead and type those in the chat. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Anybody can do it. Go ahead. Wordplay, Allison says. Indeed, absolutely. Wordplay is a big factor in terms of hip hop creativity. Anybody else want to shoot something? Yeah, go ahead, shoot something in the chat. Give me something else. When I say hip hop, what are some of the words that come to Yes, inspirational. Absolutely. Thank you, Olivia, for that. Inspirational. Totally. One thing that I like to impart on people who are taking this workshop or class is that hip hop is, in fact, a social justice movement. It's important for us to know this, right? And social justice over the last year or two has been a really big buzzword. You hear it in the media a lot, you hear it in a lot of political and other kind of social conversations, but not a lot of us really know what it means at its core. So I want to bring up the definition here: justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, privileges, opportunities, and within a society, right? This is what hip hop is trying to bring forth when it starts back in the days, and we're going to get into the history of that. But also, I like to create this thesis statement around hip hop. When people at nonprofit galas or other places that I have to be in to navigate in certain spaces, when they ask me what hip hop is, this is what I like to give them as my educated thesis statement, right? Hip hop is a medium of cultural expression where community is created through the performance and celebration of shared experiences, desires, and circumstances. So the three main words that you should take away from this very elaborate thesis statement is community, performance, and celebration. These are the three things that hip hop is mainly about, right? First and foremost, community. That's how human beings have thrived and survived all these years on the planet Earth. We deal in families. Families, in turn, come from tribes. Tribes are part of villages. Villages are part of cities, nation states, so on and so forth. It's how human beings are able to exist by binding together in a community that is centered around something. When it comes to hip hop, our community is centered around performing and celebrating. But what is it that we're performing? What is it that we're celebrating? We're celebrating the experiences that make us who we are, the things that we want out of life, the circumstances that have all brought us together. If you've ever been to a live show and have sung at the top of your lungs your favorite hit song, along with everybody else in the audience who you don't know, you've experienced a very hip hop moment, right? That's a very communal moment where it transcends race, class, economic status, all of that. And hip hop is an amalgam of all these different moments in various forms with various artistic disciplines. Also, hip hop is remix culture, right? The idea of taking what you've been given in your circumstances, in your environment, things that you've been told, things that you've seen, and creatively reimagining and reinterpreting through your lens of individual as well as collective experience as a conduit for self awareness, self discovery, and transformation, right? We're trying to become aware of who we are, what we're capable of doing, with the hopes that all of this new knowledge is going to transform us for the better. And by transforming us for the better, we can literally remix ourselves and transcend our circumstances, be it oppression, be it poverty, be it depression, a lot of different things. I always say towards forever because it seems really heavy, right? But forever, I think, is a theme that's threaded throughout hip hop, one way or another. And we can get into that conversation a little later. But it's important also to explain why hip hop matters, right? I think a lot of people make the mistake of just bringing in hip hop to appease the kids. And sometimes kids aren't really into hip hop, right? Like, oh, let's just get some cool thing to. But no, ultimately, hip hop matters because number one, it is the predominant form of youth self expression all throughout the world. There is just as many DJ and breakdance battles in Russia as there are in Texas, as there are in China, as there are in Europe, as there are in Africa. Hip hop is a worldwide global phenomenon. It's the most streamed genre of music on the planet Earth. So whether you're on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, Amazon, wherever you go to listen to music, hip hop is the number one streamed genre of music. It sets the tone and pace for all of pop culture. So even if you're not a hip hop fan, even if you're not even to name a rapper, I'm sure you're able to name some pop artist who has worked with some producer or some songwriter who is from hip hop culture. So it's not something that you can really avoid. It sets the tone for everything. They're literally using hip hop to sell McDonald's hamburgers, right? So that just goes to show the popularity of it. And like I said before, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry that employs hundreds of thousands of creative young people. And young people is important because it's youth culture that drives this entire culture. Even though I'm almost in my 40s and there are a lot of hip hop heads who are older, they recognize the importance and the value of this being a culture that is driven by young people. It is young people who created this culture so many years ago, and it's young people who continue to drive and set the trends within the culture. So let's get into the history of it, right? Hip hop starts in New York City. Did anybody know that before right now? Some people knew that, maybe? Okay, cool. Do you know exactly where? You can unmute yourself if you want, or you could type it in the chat. What borough, right? We have all these boroughs of New York City. I'm a proud New York City boy. I was born and raised in Manhattan, but you have Staten Island, you have Brooklyn, you have Queens, you have the Bronx. Where was hip hop started? And Allison is 100% correct. Hip hop did start in the Boogie Down Bronx, the South Bronx in particular. And this is the Bronx in the 1970s, right? Kind of not your most pleasant place to be, but there's a reason behind all of that stuff. The rubble that you're seeing these children stand on and play in used to be a building. There were landlords who were actually burning their buildings down to get insurance money because that was more profitable for them than to rent them. There were people who couldn't afford rent, so they were actually squatting and living in the abandoned buildings that you see surrounding these children. No running electricity, no running water. This is kind of speaking to the dire times that hip hop is created in the midst of all this kind of turmoil. But you're also talking about a country that was devastated by the 1960s, and we're going to get into the details of that. The Vietnam War was ending towards the early 70s. There was a national recession. New York was suffering from a bad economy. An economic crisis was sweeping the state as well as the city, particularly. High crime, so crime was raising all throughout New York City, and gangs are being created among young people. Not only, when I say young people, I'm not talking about kids in their 20s or whatever the case. I'm talking about young, like from 12 to 17 years old. They were joining and forming gangs as a means of gaining, again, a sense of security, a sense of community, right? But also to procure what very little resources they had in these impoverished and oppressed neighborhoods, right? But you're talking about a country as a whole that was devastated by the events of the 1960s. So, what were those events? We're talking about the civil rights movement. We're also talking about the creation of the Black Panther Party. You had the hippie counterculture. You also had the anti war movement. And you also, in the midst of all of this political and social turmoil, had 5 to 6 political assassinations. First, you had Medgar Evers, who was the head of the NAACP in Mississippi. He was assassinated in 1963. Later on that year, we would have the assassination of our president, John F. Kennedy. By 1965, you have the assassination of Malcolm X. And then by 1968, not only do you have the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, but also Bobby Kennedy, who was running for president at the time. And then I would also mention you had the assassination in 1969 of Chairman Fred Hampton, who was 21 years old and was the leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. They actually just released a movie called Judas and the Black Messiah that won an Oscar that was based on the life of Chairman Fred Hampton. So in the midst of 5 years, you had all these political assassinations, which I like to submit and argue that this collectively traumatizes us as Americans, right? We're going through a hard social time, and by the time we get into the 70s, Americans are somewhat not only traumatized, but devastated by all this. And this revolutionary fervor that we were feeling in the 60s starts to mutate and radicalize in a lot of different ways as we get into the 70s. We're talking about dealing with collective trauma that happens to large groups of individuals, that's transmitted transgenerationally and across communities. So war, like we had in the Vietnam War, genocide, slavery, terrorism, natural disasters, all of these type of things deal with or can cause collective trauma, which then can be defined as historical, ancestral, or cultural. It's important to note this because this is where hip hop comes from. It comes from an amalgam of all these tensions and traumas that are not only in the collective consciousness of Americans, but particularly people of color in impoverished neighborhoods like the Bronx in New York City. But in the 70s, you had the Weather Underground. They were a radical terrorist organization that was literally wanting to go to war with capitalism and American imperialism. So they were bombing different banks and other financial institutions, government institutions. You had the People's Temple, which was an offshoot of the hippie counterculture, who by 1979, most of their members suffered from a collective or a mass suicide. And this speaks again to the radical nature that took place after the 60s. You also had the Bloods and Crips street gang becoming increasingly popular and more prevalent in the LA area as we get into the 70s, away from the 60s and the social movements there. You had the Black Liberation Army. Some of the more prominent members of the Black Liberation Army are Assata Shakur, who is in political asylum in Cuba, as well as Afeni Shakur, who is the mother of the late great Tupac Shakur. Both of them come from this organization, which again is an offshoot of the Black Panther Party. On the East Coast, especially in New York, you had the rise of the Nation of Gods and Earths, otherwise known as the 5% Nation. And this was a small group of individuals who were an offshoot of the Nation of Islam, which many of us know is an offshoot of traditional Islam, but they specialized in recruiting young men for this kind of movement, which was a social spiritual movement. But then you also had groups like the Black Spades. The Black Spades were one of the largest gangs in New York City, thousands of members all around the boroughs of New York. And they're important for a different reason that we'll come to later. But then in the midst of all this, you also had creative social movements that were rooted in creativity and especially music, that they were using this creativity to buck the status quo, right? So a lot of that came in the way of disco music, right? On the heels of the Stonewall riots, you had the popularity increase of disco music in the bars and the nightclubs of lower Manhattan. And this is important because it introduces us to the idea and the concept of two turntables and a mixer, right? So that the music is continuous and it never stops. This is something that this gentleman here would then later take on. This man goes by the name of Clive Campbell, also known as DJ Kool Herc. DJ Kool Herc, by all accounts, is the certified godfather of what we now know as hip hop. And it was at this building, 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx, where he created the merry-go-round style of DJing. Now, what's so interesting is that Kool Herc did this merry-go-round style of DJing at his sister's back to school party. I used to think it was her birthday party, but it was actually his sister who wanted to raise money to get school clothes. So she put together this party and employed her brother to be the DJ for this. And it was at this party that DJ Kool Herc creates the merry-go-round style of DJing. Now check this flyer that they put out on an index card. This was the back to school jam, and this was the invite that everybody in the neighborhood got to attend this party. It's kind of history in the making, right? So let's see. I want to play you some of the breaks that DJ Kool Herc played during that party, right? Because it was at that party he creates the merry-go-round style of DJing. Well, what is the merry-go-round style of DJing? The merry-go-round style of DJing is a performative style of DJing where the DJ takes the isolated break beats of obscure disco records and plays them back to back with one another, essentially extending the break so that people can dance more or dance differently to this new style of listening to music. So I want to play for you one of the breaks that he had during these parties that's very popular. It's from a James Brown song called Get Up and Turn It Loose. And if you want, you can go ahead and clap your hands on top of your feet. I do it all the time. In the jungle, brother. In the jungle, brother. In the jungle, brother. Clap your hands. Now, I'll stop it there, and I just want to spotlight the fact that he's saying clap your hands, stomp your feet. James Brown, one of the more popular artists in America, 50s, 60s, going into the 70s, extremely popular artist, kind of also a godfather of hip hop in a sense because we're getting all of our style from him one way or another, but particularly his performance energy, right? The call and response, the idea of clap your hands and stomp your feet, the performer inviting the audience to do something and the audience responding in word and action. This is something that would be later taken on by well-known MCs who become the rappers in the culture, right? We're taking cues from James Brown, and we're not going to do it from James Brown unless Kool Herc is playing this record at his parties. Right? Let's see. There's another record here. Some of you may be more familiar with this one. This song is called Bongo Rock. It's actually a cover or a remix of a song called Apache. This song, Apache, was extremely popular in the 60s. Even the Beatles, when they were in the UK, still coming up in the bars and nightclubs in London, were using Apache and creating a different version of it. So in this case, the Incredible Bongo Band made a version of it with a cool percussive intro. If you knew anything about hip hop before today, you know you play this record and break dancers will literally come out of the walls and start dancing to this. Like that's what they do. Like this is literally a hip hop anthem when it comes to break dancers and doing their thing. Right? So, unbeknownst to a lot of people, hip hop is started by DJs. It's a particularly special kind of DJing that's done at parties for younger people in the Bronx. Not the bars and the nightclubs, not the discotheques. It's literally house parties in the Bronx that give birth to what we then find out as hip hop. And the stars of those parties were the DJs. So you had DJ Kool Herc, known for the merry-go-round style of DJing, like we talked about, the rare break beats. He also had these really big speakers that he borrowed from his parents that he would drive around, and people would know a Kool Herc party because they would actually hear the sound from his speakers bouncing off of the tall buildings in the Bronx. That's how you didn't have GPS, didn't have Facebook invites, none of that stuff. You had this. Right, you also had Grandmaster Flash, who is not only an innovator, but he is an inventor. He took the merry-go-round style of DJing and he started expanding upon it. So he took percussive beats from one record and started to mix and blend them with songs that didn't have any percussion in them. It created the basis for what we now know as hip-hop beat making. Right, the idea of taking or sampling an old song and adding some new cool slapping drums on them. It comes from the way that Grandmaster Flash did his DJing. He was also known for scratching. He wasn't the inventor of the scratch, it was somebody else in his crew, but he was very much known for scratching. This is part of the reason he has the name Grandmaster Flash, because he wanted to be the fastest in terms of transitioning from one song playing to the audience and moving into the next song. And the best way for him to do this, as a certified electrician, he basically repurposed the light switch and created what he then called the flash box. The flash box allowed him to listen to one record while playing another for the audience, and then at the flip of a switch, toggling from one song playing to the next song playing. This eventually evolved into what we now know as the crossfader, which comes standard on every piece of DJ equipment you can ever buy. Right? Now, had this man trademarked this, he'd probably be a billionaire by now. But unfortunately he didn't. But most people accredit the crossfader on mixers for DJs now to what Grandmaster Flash was doing with the flash box so long ago. Then you had this brother by the name of Africa Bambaataa. Africa Bambaataa was not only just a DJ, but in his senior year of high school was a very well-known and influential gang leader. He was one of the leaders in the Black Spade street gang that we were talking about earlier. And in his last year of high school, he becomes conscious, or quote unquote woke, right? He wins a UNICEF writing contest that allows him to go to Africa. And it is in Africa where he starts to develop a new, profoundly different understanding of African history as it relates to what's going on with him and his friends in the Bronx, right? He's starting to piece together African history, and particularly the Zulu tribes of South Africa and how they united despite their differences to fight off British imperialism. He found a lot of parallels between that and what gangs were doing in New York City, where they were trying to move away from the violence because they were tired of the killing, they were tired of the fighting, and they wanted to find ways to peacefully transition from gangs into community organizations. And it was on that wave that he comes back to the United States and wants to completely rebrand the gang that he is part of. So from the Black Spade street gang, you get the Zulu Nation. The Zulu Nation is, by all accounts, the people or the group that created the ideological framework around what we consider hip hop. It is all developed by the Zulu Nation. So again, they come from the Black Spade street gang originally. What they started doing to kind of move away from the reputation of the Black Spades and rebranding themselves as Zulu Nation is that they started incorporating principles of African and Eastern spirituality into their gang practices and into their symbols, as a sense of pride, as a sense of understanding their own history, as a sense of developing some level of moral compass that was far away from what they were doing before. They also started creating collectives of artists. So this popular hip hop thing that's going around in the Bronx, they started taking members of their gang and creating collectives of DJs, rappers, breakdancers, MCs, all these different things, and they were starting to throw their own parties. Now, the purpose of their parties were not only for kids to have a safe space to have fun, but mainly for other gangs who had beef with one another to come and negotiate some sort of truce or peace treaty amongst them. So they were using the power of the party to make peace between rival gangs in non-violent ways. And if they couldn't come to an agreement, those gangs would actually battle it out in breakdancing, DJing, MCing, all so that they could live. They weren't being violent. They would duke it out creatively, and then they would move on with their lives. So this is something extremely revolutionary as it relates to gang culture in New York City, gang culture in general, youth culture in general. They're starting to use these parties to make peace. They're using these parties as a safe space for people to go rather than dealing in violence and any of those things. But most importantly, the Zulu Nation is important because they are the first group to consider hip hop as a culture, right? And the word culture is important, right? We use the word all the time in hip hop. We always say that we're going to do it for the culture. The Migos literally have 3 albums. They just released a new album called Culture, right? One of them has a daughter named Culture. So the word is extremely important as it relates to hip hop, right? But what do we mean when we say culture? We're talking about the expression of human intellect, the arts, or other manifestations of human intellectual achievement, right? So it's a very long way of saying culture is the way that human beings artistically and creatively express themselves. So I want to learn from you all. Give me in the chat some ways that you or people you know creatively express themselves. What are some forms of creative expression? You could drop all of those in the chat. Let's see. What are some creative ways that human beings express themselves? Megan, boom, exactly. Fashion, clothing. Clothing is a form of expression, right? Cooking, baking, 100%. What else? I know you got more. Come on, give me some more. Art. Absolutely. Absolutely. Not only visual art, but other forms of art. Spoken word, singing, music, dancing. All of these are forms of culture, are forms of cultural expression, or forms of artistry, right? So Zulu Nation is looking at the hip hop jam. They're looking at the kids in the Bronx and they're saying, wait a minute, we have singing, we have rapping, we have music going on, we have dancing, we have art going on. All the things that we're doing in this party is, in fact, a culture. And as such, it needs to be preserved. It needs to now, because they not only understood that it was a culture, but they understood that it was a culture that was transitioning and transforming people to be better, right? They're no longer dealing in violence. They're no longer dealing in gang activity. They're now having a sense of pride by being creative, by creating creative identities for themselves and having a sense of pride and reputation based on their creativity and not their crimes, right? Like this is something that's extremely revolutionary at the time, and it's something that we take for granted for now. So within this culture, there are 5 elements and 4 principles in terms of hip hop. So hip hop is comprised of DJing because it started with the DJ, breaking, dancing to these breaks of records, which is why they're called break dancers, breaking, MCing, which is the rapping, graffiti, or they call it writing, and knowledge. Knowledge being the 5th element and the most important because it's how you tie all the other artistic elements together. In order for you to be a DJ or a breakdancer or an MC, you need to have knowledge. It's how we filter our knowledge through these creative outlets that determines our value, our worth as creatives or as artists. It develops our reputation in our community based on these things. So you have to have knowledge of music to be a good DJ. You need to have knowledge of language to be a good MC, right? Knowledge of movement and kinesthetic knowledge to be a breakdancer, and knowledge of color palettes and other different things to be a great graffiti artist. So it's knowledge that kind of ties all these different things together. But also, hip hop is backed by 4 principles. So you have the 5 elements that we went over. You also have these 4 principles: peace, love, unity, and having fun. These served as kind of the community agreements for every hip hop jam. This is what people intended to do by going into a hip hop jam. You're going to be peaceful, loving, you're going to be unified, they're there to have a good time. It was all about enjoying yourself, finding a safe space in the midst of the oppression, in the midst of the turmoil, in the midst of the racism, in the midst of the poverty, in the midst of the buildings literally collapsing around you. This was a safe space for people to enjoy themselves, particularly young people. So, any questions on that? Are we good? Cool. Yeah? All right. Awesome. So we're going to kind of deep dive into each of these elements, and then we're going to use some of their time towards the second hour to really get into a lot of the particulars of each of these elements. So you had DJing, right? Now, what made hip hop DJs unique among other DJs is the way they DJed. It was more performative than it was anything else. The DJ was using the turntables in the way that a pianist uses the piano or a guitar player uses the guitar, right? It was involving looping the breaks that we were talking about, mixing and blending not only different songs, but different sounds, and then scratching and turntablism, using the turntable that's traditionally used for just playing music and using it like it's a musical instrument in and of itself. So let's play this video real quick. Say go DJ, that my DJ. Crazy. DJ. Crazy. DJ, that my DJ. Crazy. DJ, that my I feel ready. 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 All right, I'm gonna stop it right there for a lot of different reasons. One, because if we let the music keep going, we're gonna just jam out and we're not even gonna get to the rest of this, right? Number one. Number two, I wanted to freeze it right here because if you look in the middle right here, that is, in fact, the crossfader that we were talking about earlier. This is one of the things that most DJs use to create the elaborate scratches and party sets that they do. And again, it was invented by Grandmaster Flash, right? But what's so unique about hip hop DJing is that if you just heard that piece of music that we were playing, if you closed your eyes, you would probably just think it was a musical beat, just a beat like any other piece of music that you were listening to. You probably didn't think of, or you maybe have taken for granted the fact that every sound that you just heard was being done in real time with his hands, right? From the turntables to the mixer to the cues, all of that. So everything that we're hearing, all of this elaborate musical composition is being done in real time, improvisationally, using his hands on the turntables. And that is hip hop turntablism and why it sets itself apart from just putting in a CD or just playing a song and then moving to the next song. That's what makes the hip hop DJs unique among other kinds of DJs. But then you have breaking, which I'm always a fan of because the community and the agility, the physical agility that these uh, breakers have is just nothing short of amazing, right? So again, they're called break dancers because they dance to the breaks of records, right? Like that's otherwise known as b-boys or b-girls is how they were known. And a point of fact is that if you were involved in hip hop in any way, you were considered a b-boy or a b-girl. You didn't have to necessarily break dance, right? Because you were one of the people who attended the parties where the breaks were being spun. So you were considered a b-boy and b-girl. And in the early days of hip hop, b-boys and b-girls who attended hip hop parties had a different style of dress. So going back to culture, right? And Megan saying clothing, fashion was extremely important because it identified who was a hip hopper and who wasn't, right? Who was a b-boy, who was down, and who wasn't, right? And we'll get into the entire definition of hip hop in a minute as well. But in the same way that DJs are taking from different musical influences, right? DJ Kool Herc is pulling from funk records. He's pulling from jazz. He's pulling from rock and roll. All these different influential musical elements. Breakdancers are pulling from different dance elements and dance influences. So they're taking from salsa and mambo, and they're also taking from James Brown. Again, James Brown was not only a great singer, but he was a great dancer, right? So they're taking from all these, they're stirring it in a pot, but they're also adding a mix of martial arts. Unbeknownst to a lot of people, martial arts had a humongous role in the advent of breakdancing because in 1973 is the death of Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee dies the same year that hip hop is born, right? Bruce Lee posthumously, meaning after his death, releases a movie called Enter the Dragon. Enter the Dragon unilaterally creates a new wave of interest in martial art movies, so much so that there were whole movie theaters in New York City dedicated to playing martial art movies in the theater. On Channel 5 in New York City, I remember being a kid, and from 12 to 3 on Saturdays, you could watch martial art movies. By 3 p.m., I thought I knew all the secrets of the Shaolin Temple, and I thought I was going to kick and beat up my brother with all this newfound knowledge. So martial arts is very much embedded in the dancing styles of breakdancers. But then if you look at hip hop as a whole, you can see the influence of martial arts in groups like Wu-Tang and other people where there is that influence. So you mix martial arts, you mix Abuelita's mambo and salsa in there, you throw a dash of James Brown in there, and you get all of this. So here's some salsa for you, some mambo. I want you to pay attention to the freezing and the movement. Shout out to all my salsa dancers. I can't wait to dance salsa again. I'm dying for it. So I wanted to show that to you. Let's see what else. Let's show some James Brown real quick.
I did this in the Tammy show. Also, robot.
The robot, though. Who has the uncle at the cookout who dances like this? Anybody? I think I am the uncle at the cookout who dances like this. So, but then let's see. And we were talking about martial arts, so let's just show you a clip of this. Check the posing, the posturing, the acrobatics that you're about to see. Nice. Right, so you put all that in a pot and then you get, let's see, where is it? And this is a style of breakdancing called uprocking. There was actually a style of dance called rocking before breakdancing took place that they also incorporated with all these other things. So if you actually bear with me, I'm going to play you a different video. 1 second here. Let me see. And while I'm looking for it, does anybody have any questions? Any questions? Okay. No. Alrighty. Well. Okay, go back to sharing my screen. So like I've been saying, if you mix all of those things up in a pot, you get this. This is a montage of international breakdance competitions. You could see the agility, you can see all the influence of all these other forms of dance. Who feels like they can do any of that? Nobody? No? No? Give it a try. Why not? Cool. Well, let's keep it moving. Let's see. Now we're going to get into graffiti. And graffiti is actually a lot more influential than people would give it credit for. Graffiti is part of the reason that hip hop leaves the Bronx to begin with, and I'll tell that story in a little bit. But unbeknownst to a lot of people, graffiti is actually an Italian word, graffiti, right? It means to scratch or mark. It's not a pasta, it's not a sauce. It is a word that is made for scratching or marking. It was a term that was used during the 1920s, during the dictatorship of Mussolini. It was Mussolini who, because of his kind of authoritarian regime, a lot of resistance was met, and a lot of those people who defected or resisted Mussolini's power would express their contempt and their displeasure by drawing and painting and writing words in open spaces all throughout Italy, to the point where Mussolini set out a task force to get rid of graffiti writers. They then applied that word to what writers were doing in New York City in the late 60s going into the 70s, starting with a person by the name of Taki 183. That was his nickname, that was his tag name. He used the word Taki, and then 183 was the street that he was from, 183rd Street in Washington Heights. I lived on 177th Street in Washington Heights. Literally 6 blocks away was the inventor of what we now know as writing or graffiti, and he was doing it all throughout the city. That's what made him well known, is that he was literally tagging this in trains, billboards, and other open spaces all throughout New York City. And slowly but surely, other people started copying. And then other people started developing it. Rather than just using one word and one color, people were then using multiple colors. People were then creating elaborate murals. They were doing block letters. They were doing bubble letters. It became a whole scene and subculture in and of itself. I want to play you a clip of a 1982 documentary called Style Wars.
People who commit graffiti often share two things in common.
Let's see. So in here. Give me 1 second. I'm playing around with multiple multiple slide presentations, so I'm gonna get it for you. Here we go.
Graffiti writing in New York is a vocation. Its traditions are handed down from one youthful generation to the next. To some, it's art. To most people, however, it is a plague that never ends. A symbol that we've lost control.
That's, that's about the third scheme piece I did this shit. And that's the TikTok I did in Gun Hill.
What'd you do last night?
We did 2 whole cars. It was me, Dez, and Mean 3, right? And on the first car, in small letters, it said, "All you see is," and then, big, block silver letters, it said, "Crime in the city," right?
It just took up the whole car?
Yeah, it was a whole car and shit. Then it was a scroll, like, one of those scrolls. And then on the next car, it was a scheme and it had, a cop character and shit, a police nigga with a stick, and a badge.
What designs you put around the
Society should go down in the subway.
So one moment, I have a fire truck going on, but what I wanted to kind of say with this is I want to just bring up the entire concept of what he's saying is going all city, right? He's going to go into this concept of all city, and I'll explain it.
Knock them all up because they don't have any business down there. It is dangerous down there. People that work down there 25 and 30 years have accidents. But his contention is that he's immortal, I guess, like most 17-year-olds are immortal, right?
Well, it's a matter of getting a tag on each line and each division. It's called going all city. People see your tags in Queens, uptown, downtown, all over.
So I'm gonna stop it there because that's the part that I wanted to get to, the concept of going all city, right? The question is asked, what would make a 17-year-old kid from the Bronx want to go into a dangerous train yard just to draw his name on a train? Right? And you have to consider all the other environmental and circumstantial things that are around them, right? Just the oppression, the poverty, the feeling of being ignored, the feeling of being marginalized. This would prompt any young person, I would imagine, to do something to be heard, right? And that's the idea. The idea is to draw these elaborate murals so that you have a reputation that precedes you, right? He's drawing on a train. Trains in New York City, if you've ever been there, are often above ground. They go into the subway, but they can go from the Bronx all the way to Brooklyn, which is 15 miles away. And feasibly, this drawing, this mural that you've done on a train car, can be seen by hundreds of thousands of people every day, and they can see your name. So I can understand the appeal. for a 17-year-old boy to want to be well known in that regard. But there were other people around the same time who took different approaches to this concept of going all city, right? One of them would be a young man from Pennsylvania who moved to New York City, and then rather than drawing on the trains themselves, would go to train platforms and draw in the empty advertising space. And this was Keith Haring. Keith Haring would then be a toast of the art world and be commissioned to draw elaborate murals all throughout New York City and the rest of the world. This is one example of his murals, Crack is Whack. He did this in 1986, right? What I particularly found so powerful about this is that he is providing social commentary to something that is plaguing the community, right? The crack epidemic is at its full height in New York City at this time, and he is literally using slang term and hip hop terminology to speak out against it, right? To this day, this mural is still maintained in New York City as a landscape. They have not gotten rid of it. I actually have a shirt in my closet that has the same mural, but it's just on a black shirt, and I love it. It's like one of my favorite pieces of clothing that I bought recently. But it speaks to the importance of this mural. It speaks to the importance of Keith Haring's work, and in general, I actually have a Keith Haring figurine that I bought in New York City. I don't even know what's in this box. There's one of these characters is in this box, and I still don't know who it is, and I'm leaving it that way. I will never find out, I guess. Well, maybe one of these days, but we'll see. But what I also want to say about Keith Haring is that towards the end of the 80s into the 90s, he unfortunately passes away of AIDS. But afterwards, his work is then used as the aesthetic for the AIDS awareness campaign. They use his work to bring awareness to this disease all around the world. So again, this is a graffiti writer from the culture of hip hop who in turn is then commissioned to create all these elaborate murals, who becomes the toast of the art world, who is then quote unquote legitimized by having art gallery showings and is selling his paintings, and now he's his work is being used for the AIDS awareness campaign, all of these things, right? There's another artist who, again, homeless on the train, 17 years old, and him and his friend would go around New York City and they would draw little philosophical musings like this one, Life is Confusing at this point, and it would be tagged Same Old, right? Which was short for Same Old Same. But the person doing this was JeanMichel Basquiat, which was one of the more popular artists of his time, especially at the end of the 20th century. He was a contemporary of another popular artist by the name of Andy Warhol, who's well known all around the world for his pop art and his remix art of literally taking pictures of Marilyn Monroe and the Campbell soup can and remixing them, splashing new dabs of paint, new forms of color on them. So they were kindred spirits in the sense that they came from the same kind of creative position. Just 2 years ago, a painting for JeanMichel Basquiat was sold for $110 million. I think it has the record now for being the most expensive painting ever sold. Again, Graffiti Kid, right? One person that I will honorably mention who is not listed in this presentation is Fab Five Freddy, who back in the early 80s was commissioned to do murals in the punk rock and new wave clubs of downtown Manhattan. And because of his relationship with the DJs in the Bronx, he started finding ways to start bringing the DJs from the Bronx into these punk rock clubs, where now you're having an interaction between two completely different worlds. You have these white kids in downtown Manhattan now mixing it up with the B-boys and the B-girls from the Bronx, and that creates a new synergy. It creates a new sound. The DJs, Africa Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flash Cool Herc, are now in these downtown nightclubs. They're getting booked for gigs all around New York City. It's part of the reason hip hop spreads out of the Bronx and into the rest of the city. Fab Five Freddy would then later go on and host the MTV show Yo MTV Raps, which ran for, I want to say 5, 6, maybe almost 10 years. But he was the originator of this, and he's so instrumental and influential within the culture. And again, a graffiti artist. So you can see how graffiti has permeated popular culture and has made hip hop in one way or another accessible. We don't get things like the Obama Hope poster without these graffiti artists beforehand. Shepard Fairey himself is a street artist who took a lot of his cues from early graffiti artists. So I just wanted to shout that out as well. Okay, give me 1 minute. How are we doing? Are we good? Any questions on anything? Any concerns? Any insights? I want to hear from you all. We're about to get into some cool activities in just a minute, but it's really important that we kind of lay down the groundwork for all of these different elements within hip hop culture. So bear with me, and I appreciate everybody's patience and all the things. So let's continue on. Now I'm actually going to show you some work from JeanMichel Basquiat. There we go. Some of his paintings right here. I think it was this painting that sold for $110 million, just so you know. This is kind of a redo. This wasn't a JeanMichel Basquiat original, but they kind of used his style to do a street mural. And then here are some of his collaborations with Andy Warhol. And I think they're actually bringing this to a museum in New York City in 2022. They're going to do a whole art gallery of JeanMichel Basquiat paintings and stuff. So now we get into the element that I love the most, the MC, right? This is how most people become exposed to hip hop, through rap music and through the MC. So the MC starts as a party host, as the DJ in the Bronx back in the 70s was doing this elaborate merry-go-round technique. They could no longer talk to the audience in the way that they used to, and the DJ was the star of the show. So what they needed is somewhat of a hype man to come in and serve as the buffer between the party goers and the DJ. So this party host would basically shout out all the fly boys and the fly girls at the party, big up the DJ, make sure that everybody was having a good time. But they would also do this with call and response, like we learned from James Brown. They would do this with these little freestyle rapping rhyme schemes that they would put together to charm the audience, to engage them, to do call and response like we were saying before. And all of this, the synergy between the MC, the party host, and the DJ, and the break dancers getting on the floor as all of this is going on, created what they then called the routine. There were a lot of hip hop crews that were known for their parties and them doing or breaking out into this routine at the height of the party when everything is at a fever pitch. They would go into this performance routine. The routine, this synergy between all of them and the audience, becomes the basis for your modern day rap song. It becomes the basis for how we listen to songs from the Migos or J. Cole or Jay-Z or any artist that you listen to. The call and response. If you've ever been to a rap concert, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Even if you're just in your house listening to rap music on YouTube and watching a music video, everything that you're seeing in one form or another is pulled from these original efforts, these original party tactics that were made to entertain the young people going to these parties. But then from 1973 to 1979, hip hop literally only exists as a party in the Bronx for young people. It's not a genre of music yet. It is not a music that you can find on the radio or on TV or the movies or any of that. It's not until 1979 that we get this group, the Sugar Hill Gang, right? And we get them from a retired R&B artist by the name of Sylvia Robinson. Had it not been for Sylvia Robinson, we probably wouldn't know hip-hop in the way that we know it today. Sylvia Robinson had a record label called Sugar Hill Records. And in the late 70s, she is invited to a club in New York City called Harlem World. It takes place in the heart of Harlem, and they were having a hip-hop jam that night. She is so blown away by what she sees at this hip-hop jam. She wants to put it on a record. Now, at the time, the true blue members of the hip-hop community, especially the MCs and the rappers, weren't really sure if they wanted to create a record or to make a record and sign a record deal. They didn't even know what they were doing. They didn't know that this was a genre of music. They just considered it party culture. And that's what they stuck with. But nonetheless, Sylvia Robinson got these three brothers to put together a rap record by looping a disco record, just a bass line, and literally having a cipher over the record that would then become Rapper's Delight, which is the first rap song that was ever played or ever done and recorded in 1979. So I'll play a little.
Here's Wonder Mike, Hank, and Master G, the Sugar Hill Gang.
The hip hop, you don't stop. Rock it out, baby, rubber to the boogity bang bang, the boogie to the boogity beat. Now what you hear is not a test. I'm rapping to the beat, and me, the groove, and my friends are gonna try to move your feet. You see, I'm
gonna pause it there. It's really interesting that hip hop is now so intergenerational. There are people who exist now who this was their brand of hip hop, and they have grandchildren who are into hip hop who live in a completely different hip hop world than the hip hop that they grew up with, right? Just it just speaks to the multi generations that we now have, where before people literally thought hip hop was a fad. They thought it was gonna go in and out like the fidget spinner. Everybody remember those fidget spinners from like 3 years ago? No one has them anymore, right? They literally thought that this music was going to be that it was something to get rich quick from and then leave at the wayside, right? But unbeknownst to them, we're now here and we are somewhat the mainstream in a sense, in one sense or another. So let's get into this final element, and then after this element we're going to get into some cool activities. So we have knowledge. Knowledge is the fifth and final element of hip-hop, and when we refer to knowledge, we're mainly talking about knowledge of self and the world around you, right? Learning who you are in relation to your family, friends, and community at large. Part of learning who you are is that what I like to call that remix process, that alchemical process of experimenting with different forms of creativity, having thoughts and ideas and feelings in your heart and in your mind that you then express in form of a graffiti piece, that you then express in the form of a rap or a beat or breakdancing, right? This is how most of our artists were starting to learn about who they are, and starting to develop and instill senses of pride in themselves, but in turn, a sense of pride or collective pride within the community. Now you have artists who are literally changing their identity overnight. They used to be Papo, the street kid who was stealing things off the train, but now it's this DJ or it's this breakdancer who's well known in the community for the cool moves that he does or that cool remix that he did or whatever the case is. It gives young people in this environment a new avenue to access a sense of pride for themselves. And that's what this knowledge does. That's what this culture does, right? But it doesn't stop there. Knowledge, as it relates to hip hop, also means reading and researching about different cultures, animal, plant life, the environment that you're in. So you can take all that knowledge and express it and communicate it through all of these artistic outlets. But then also asserting your knowledge through empathy, compassion, tolerance, and becoming a global citizen, literally becoming part of a collective community that is rooted in all these forms of expression. So that is definitely what hip hop brings to the table as it relates to shifting the cultures and shifting opinions and everything. So with that, before we get into the next section, I just want to kind of decompress. Let us all take a breath or so. I know I threw a lot of information at you all, so we're just on the count of three. We're gonna breathe in deep through the nose and then out through the mouth. We'll do that 3 times. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Everyone, breathe in. And breathe out. We'll do that 2 more times. Breathe in. And breathe out. Last time, breathe in. And breathe out. Excellent. Thank you so much for participating in that. Hopefully that gave you a little bit more energy, a little bit more focus. But I'm going to use this time to see if anybody has any questions about any of the information that I've shared so far before we move forward. You can either write the questions in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and ask, and we could just kick it.